want to talk about Martin Luther King Jr., or better known as Michael King Jr. At least that's what his birth records indicate. But this was an idol set up for so-called black people by the higher-ups or the Caucasian Jewish elites and so forth. But when we read the scriptures, we know that the Most High told the children of Israel to get out of idolatry because they were surrounded by the nations around them. Now, this idol, Martin Luther King, he's very worshipped among so-called blacks in the Christian delegation or the religion or the different sects and so forth. But when we really delve into Martin Luther King, he was not this quote-unquote saint, because we know by the scriptures, the saints are the Israelites, according to the scripture and context. So who was Martin Luther King? Was he just an idol set up for the elites? And why was he assassinated? Because his script was over. But they have a file on him, and this is their idol that they set up for so-called blacks, who preach the liberal or Marxist ideologies about equality. But we know in real life, equality doesn't exist. You have to take charge. You have to have rulership. There's a head and there's a tail. It can't be one and the same. It's right here in the article. It states, Dr. King was assassinated 3 weeks after the dossier was written. A secret FBI dossier on civil rights leader Martin Luther King alleges that he had a string of affairs and other sexual aberrations, as well as links to the Communist Party. Now let's look up the word aberrations. Aberration, and it states, plural noun, aberrations, a departure from what is normal, usual, or expected, typically one that is unwelcome. So I've highlighted abnormality, freak, and oddity. So Martin Luther King had a lot of demons or skeletons in his closet. And then when we look at the Christian church today, at least from a point of view from social media, there's a lot of nonsense and there's no wisdom or knowledge that's being taught in these churches. So right here we have a flyer or poster, because we know Martin Luther King's day of celebration is on January the 16th. But they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Now we see a lot of these flyers or posters, they're done out of ignorance. But also when we really look and delve into his file, Martin Luther King was just a pawn, upon the grand script of everything. But he was a puppet used by the Marxist communist parties and the Caucasian Jews, kind of like a mechanism to control so-called black people, because a lot of our people do not know our history. And our people are caught up into idolatry. So they look at these certain figures that are put up in the so-called black community as leaders. But a lot of these leaders were bugged out of their minds, had addictions, had demons, and so forth. And yes, every so-called black man and woman go through adversities, trials, and tribulations, in our lives. But at the same time, when we turn on that television and we look at these figures that are put as the head of quote unquote black community, what is the community? Are we a community that's in unity or unison as far as the color of our skin? Because we all have different shades of melanin, brown, light, and so forth. Does that make us a community because we all have melanin or different shades? That doesn't make us a community. If anything, the so-called black community is divided. You have your spiritual, you have your religious, you have your Christians and 5%ers, 7%ers, and so forth. So there is no unity. You cannot unite under melanin or your color of your skin, because everyone has a different ideology. And a lot of people don't adhere to the scriptures of the Most High, the God of Israel. Also, too, they use Martin Luther King as an idol, a mechanism to control the psyche, or to use him as a tool for victimization. We've been here 400 years in chains. But when we really look at the 16, 17, and 1800s, there were a lot of prominent so-called black people who own farms or own plantations. We haven't even delved into that, because there were black slave masters, in the colonial times and whatnot. So this notion, when we see in movies of Roots, that all so-called black African Americans came on slave ships. No, that's fantasy. That's narrative. And they push it through these Caucasian liberals and these so-called black liberals who want to hold the white man's hand. They don't want to be rulers. They want to be equal with their oppressors. Getting back to the article, it states, it is dated just 3 weeks before Dr. King's assassination in 1968. The file was released in a tranche of documents relating to the assassination of John F. Kennedy released on Friday. Mr. Kennedy is not referenced in the file, and it is not clear why it was kept secret for almost 50 years. There is no evidence that any of the claims in the report were verified. Its cover shows it was assessed in 1994 by FBI task force on the JFK assassination, which concluded none of the document should be released. Many of the allegations contained in the paper appeared to be reports of private conversations between others or hearsay reported third hand. One allegation that King had a mistress in California with whom he had fathered a child was a tribute to a very responsible Los Angeles individual in a position to know. Reading on, it states, among its other accusations are that Dr. King was surrounded by advisors with strong links to the Communist Party USA. His statements were always subject to approval by the alleged communist sympathizers. He was a secret supporter of communism, a wholehearted Marxist. His organization, the Southern Christians Leadership Conference, set up a tax dodge to raise funds for its activities. Dr. King took part in drunken sex orgies and coerced young women to participate. He had love affairs with at least 4 women, including folk singer Joanne Baez, if I'm pronouncing that right. The list of alleged indiscretions would likely have been deeply problematic for the civil rights leader if it had been made public in 1968. So like I stated in my other videos, the truth is a hard pill to swallow. Ignorance is bliss, and a lot of people would like to be in the comfort or comfortability of not knowing the unknown. But we have to take this with a grain of salt and look at the clues, use discernment, and why was this man put up as an idol for so-called black people? Because it seems like the fight keeps going on, but you have to ask yourselves, what are so-called black people fighting for? Shouldn't so-called black people want their own police force, their own government, their own businesses, and so forth? You see it in all the other communities. But when we read the scriptures, it said that the nation of Israel will be no more. Now we can identify with everything under the sun, but the Most High said we wouldn't even be remembered. And today we go by bywords, other misnomers to identify us. But when we read the biblical text, it describes our curses and our prophecies to the T. And they know this. Continue reading on. It says, the reason King enjoyed this close relationship with communists is best explained by the fact that Levinson in February 1962 passed the word to Gus Hall, General Secretary, CPUSA. King is a wholehearted Marxist who has studied it, Marxism, believed in it, and agrees with it, but because of his being a minister of religion, does not dare to espouse it publicly. Further, in March 1962, Levinson told a CPUSA functionary that King was concerned about a communist label being pinned on us, but that at the same time, he wanted to do everything possible to evidence friendship towards the Soviet Union. In addition, King has been described within the CPUSA as a true, genuine Marxist-Leninist from the top of his head to the tips of his toes. The feeling within the CPUSA at that time was, and still is, that King definitely follows a Marxist-Leninist line. And we must realize that Martin Luther King was a globalist. He didn't really adhere to the scriptures because, like a lot of preachers or a lot of people who try to use the spiritual essence or of that book, that it's not talking about globalization. It's talking about sovereignty. It's talking about rulership. And when you really read the scriptures, it's not talking about universal love. It's not coming together and holding everyone's hands like they did in that 1980s song of Michael Jackson, We Are the World. And when you look at the assassination of Martin Luther King, has it gotten any better for so-called black people or the so-called black community? You know, one thing we have to take in consideration is stop using the victimization and start using accountability. And like I said, it starts at home and it starts with procreation and who you're bringing into this world. A lot of these so-called black kids and these demons or these gremlins are just fulfilling their scripts or the roles that they were designed for. We know in the scriptures it talks about certain vessels were to be uplifted and certain vessels were to, be a disgrace. Or better yet, a better term would be debased, reduced in quality or value. And that equates to equality. The funny thing about people's mindsets or what they read in the scriptures is that the Most High had a chosen people, a holy people, okay? His lot, his portion. In all honesty, that's what the New Testament, which just means covenant, is about. The day of judgment, when the Most High is coming back, or Hamashiach is coming back for the chosen. Okay, it's not talking about the whole world per se. So this notion or inclusivity that they preach in these different Christian sets and these different religions is false. It has nothing to do with the scriptures. Once saved, always saved is false. It has nothing to do biblically, or it's not even in the scriptures. Being saved or having salvation during the day of judgment is a more accurate depiction of salvation, or being saved from your enemies, having divine grace, not to do anything and everything that you want to do, eating and so forth. Reading on, it says, much of the document aims to paint Dr. King as a tool of the Communist Party. The paper paints Dr. King in an extremely negative light, despite his receipt of the Nobel Peace Prize and his contribution to passing the Civil Rights Act 4 years previously. It is not entirely clear why the dossier was commissioned, but several pages of the 20-page document are concerned with Dr. King's upcoming Washington Spring project, which was scheduled for the coming months. It warned that despite Dr. King's history of calling for peaceful protests, the combined forces of the communist influence and the black nationalists advocating violence gave the Washington Spring Project a potential for an extremely explosive situation. Dr. King was killed before the planned march. Also, during his assassination, the movie Planet of the Apes came out in reference to Dr. Martin Luther King. And it states, a slow thinker with abnormal sexual preferences. Despite Dr. King's historical reputation as a skilled speaker, the FBI file claimed that other advisors approved everything Dr. King said. And we also realized that Aberrations is the one who wrote the I Have a Dream speech. And he was gay and a part of the LGBT community. So you see the correlation and you see the attachment, from the civil rights, and then you attach the LGBT. You can add a P on there nowadays, pedophilia and so forth. King is such a slow thinker. He is usually not prepared to make statements without help from someone, it reads. Linking Dr. King to communism, they claim King is a wholehearted Marxist who has studied it, Marxism, believed in it, and agrees with it. But because of his being a minister of religion, Christianity, does not dare to espouse it publicly. And in another part says, during the early 1960s, the CPUSA, the Communist Party, was striving to obtain a Negro labor correlation, to achieve its goals in this country. Martin Luther King Jr. and his organizations were made to order to achieve these objectives. The most salacious claims about Dr. King's sex life are contained in a dense collection of rumors in the final 2 pages. And I believe those are to be released in 2027. And it states, an all-night sex orgy was held with these prostitutes and some of the delegates in attendance. One room had a large table in it, which was filled with whiskey. The 2 Negro prostitutes were paid $50 to put on a sex show for the entertainment of guests. A variety of sex acts deviating from the normal were observed, previous sexual experiences. This activity is not new to King and his associates. As early as January 1964, King engaged in another 2-day drunken sex orgy in Washington, D.C. Many of those present engaged in sexual acts, natural as well as unnatural. Okay, so Martin Luther King was a pansexual or bisexual, whatever term you want to use, for the entertainment of onlookers. When one of the females shied away from engaging in an unnatural act, King and other of the males present discussed how she was to be taught and initiated in this respect. So it seems like Martin Luther King was a part of those Bacchanalian or Bacchus rites. You see a lot of those Greek fraternities where they, perform sexual ritual acts and orgies and so forth. And we see like the groves of the Playboy mansions and so forth. So the religion of Christianity was just a front, to get the people. But behind closed doors, Martin Luther King was, bugged out of his mind, was a drunk, fornication. And what I mean by fornication, I mean unnatural or aberrations. So fornication means to do things of sexual experiences that's not natural. That being man or animals, which the Bible describes as bestiality. Or they like to use terms today in modern times, pansexuals and so forth. Throughout the ensuing years and until this date, King was continued to carry on his sexual aberrations secretly while holding himself out to public view as a moral leader of religious conviction. Reading on, it says, Dr. King's alleged sexual misconduct is tackled onto the end of the file. At a February 1968 workshop to train ministers in urban leadership, it is alleged one Negro minister in attendance later expressed his disgust with the behind-the-scenes drinking, fornication, and homosexuality that went on at the conference. Several Negro and white prostitutes were brought in from the Miami area. An all-night sex orgy was held with these prostitutes and some of the delegates. The document alleged that Dr. King also engaged in a 2-day drunken sex orgy in Washington in 1964. When one of the females shied away from engaging in an unnatural act, King and other of the males present discussed how she was to be taught and initiated in this respect. It added, it is a fact that King not only regularly indulged in adulterous acts, but enjoys the abnormal by engaging in group sexual orgies. Upon closing, we should all realize that Martin Luther King used the Bible as a prompt. He wasn't adhered to the commandments and the laws and statutes. Now, we all make mistakes in life. We all have shortcomings. But overall, this man was not a saint or the heroic figure that the Jewish media likes to portray him to so-called black people, along with the boule and liberal Negroes who try to find equality or still searching to kiss the white man's ass, or to be equal, or to hold his hand in unity. And I do believe before his demise, he started to see the errors of his ways, with the certain speeches about the burning house and so forth. But by that time, they were going to, write him off the script because he had served his purpose in the grand scheme of everything. And I get it, they try to make him as a family man, but when you look at the records and whatnot, it doesn't indicate that. But peace and shalom.